Good evening, Dom. I want to tell you about a frightening experience I had. After I dropped out of high school and moved out of my parents' house, I really needed to find a job. At that stage of my life, I was willing to do practically anything to pay the rent. Luckily, or unluckily, depending on how you look at it, the local cemetery was hiring. Right from the start, the older employees who had been there for 2 or 3 decades were intrigued by someone so young choosing to become a grave digger. It was hard work that was tough on your back, but I quickly got used to it. And in the end, it felt more like free gym time than an actual job. No kidding, I got strong really fast. Honestly, it only felt like real work when the weather was bad or we had a burial. Other than that, it was even enjoyable to spend time outdoors. The cemetery where we worked had a fairly simple layout. Most of the land was made up of standard graves, all similar in size and price. However, there was a more isolated corner to the northwest that housed much larger private lots. These spaces were reserved for the wealthier families, and the funeral agent made a good amount of money selling those extravagant graves. I'm talking about full mausoleums, angel statues, and things like that. We rarely went to that part of the cemetery, except for cleaning and maintenance tasks that were never my responsibility. It wasn't personal. The older guys just didn't trust me with the chemicals and care needed to keep the marble and brass shining like new. That's why I found it so strange when on one of my days off, they called me asking if I had been in that area recently. My boss was completely irritated. You could tell by the tone of his voice, and he got straight to the point when he asked, "Have you been around the northwest lots?" I, of course, denied it. The last time I had been there was months ago during my training, when I watched one of the veterans use a chemical to clean the marble. He sighed, sounding confused and not really understanding the situation. Then I asked what the problem was. He said we could talk about it when I returned to work. I felt uneasy, but I was sure I hadn't done anything wrong, at least not on purpose, and certainly nothing related to the northwest lots. A few days later, when I arrived at work, the atmosphere was tense. It was obvious that something serious had happened. I didn't need to push too hard to understand what it was. The boss took me to the northwest corner lot without saying a word along the way, and I realized it was best to stay quiet until I knew what was going on. One of my colleagues was already there, tending to one of the graves, and that's when my boss said, "If you'd passed through this area during your lunch break, maybe eating something between the tombs, now would be the time to admit it." I swear I hadn't done that, but I knew eating near the graves wasn't a good idea, as I'd been warned it could attract wild animals, which could end up damaging some of the sites. That's when he explained what was happening. Something had tried to dig up one of the recently opened graves in the northwest lots. He emphasized something and not someone, because we all had enough experience to tell the difference between a grave dug up by tools, human hands, or, in this case, claws. The edges were uneven, with clear claw marks in the dirt, very different from the straight lines a shovel would leave. It was definitely something strange. This was an emergency, both for obvious sanitary reasons and for emotional ones. If the families found out wild animals were trying to dig up their loved ones' bodies, chaos would surely ensue. We needed to act fast. They called a meeting with all the grave diggers. From what we knew, the problem was happening at night and was probably caused by some kind of animal, like a coyote, a black bear, or even a stray dog. The solution? We would need to post a night watchman at the cemetery every night until everything was resolved. And, as you can imagine, who was voluntarily chosen for that first week? That's right, the rookie, the youngest of the team, me. The only upside to the situation was that night work paid double the normal rate, and I really needed the extra money. The first night of the watch was a real nightmare. The only thing keeping me company was a thermos full of strong coffee and a .22 caliber pellet rifle one of the colleagues had lent me to deal with any animals that showed up. It was a long, monotonous, and lonely night, but once I adjusted my sleep, things got a little more bearable. On the second to last night of my shift, I was walking a small patrol toward the northwest lot, with a flashlight in hand, and that's when I saw it. Frantic movements, like someone desperately digging at the ground. My first reaction could have been to shout or even fire into the air to scare the animal away, but if I ended up killing the creature, I'd probably lose the extra pay, and I really needed that money. I approached slowly, turned off the flashlight, and silently advanced toward the figure that was digging. I had hunted rabbits at night with my uncle, so I planned to use the old trick of shining the light suddenly to make the animal freeze for a second, giving me a chance to shoot. But when I finally illuminated whatever it was, I almost let out a scream of terror. It wasn't an animal. It was a person, crouched on all fours, digging into the earth with their bare hands. I was so stunned by what I saw that I couldn't even raise the rifle. All I could do was make noise, shouting, "Get out of here! I'll call the police." They obeyed, of course, but not out of fear. What I saw in that person's eyes was pure hatred, an intense rage at being interrupted in what they were doing. Honestly, if I hadn't been armed, if it wasn't obvious to them that I could defend myself, I don't know if I'd be here today to tell this story. Needless to say, the other workers didn't believe much in what I saw. Some even admitted that I might have seen something, but they disagreed on exactly what that was, and I get it. Honestly, I understand. But even so, I have no idea what I saw. The police didn't come up with much either. Other than a few boot prints, there weren't many clues. Whatever it was had fled into the forest, far beyond what I could see. All I know is one thing. It was, without a doubt, a person. Before we go to the next story, if you're new here, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and activate the bell to receive the upcoming stories. Your presence is important and your support is essential. Well, let's continue. About a decade ago, when I was in my 30s, I worked as a security guard at a cemetery. The place wasn't located in one of the safest areas of the city, so it was necessary to have someone there 24 hours a day. Even so, there were always people who managed to sneak in, spray painting headstones or, in some cases, even trying to dig up graves. Most of these things happened at night, which in my case wasn't so bad since I usually worked from 2 in the afternoon until 10 at night. Still, I always spent the last hours of my shift, from 8 to 10 at night, alone. It was a bit uncomfortable, but honestly, much better than the overnight shift. On this particular day, I was told that there were people walking around the cemetery at odd hours, apparently watching the place. This had been happening for a few days, but no one knew exactly who they were or what they were doing. I promised to keep an eye out. Around 6 in the evening, the other employees left, and I was alone. It was my favorite part of the shift since I didn't have to look busy all the time. To be honest, it didn't make much sense to have 2 employees there at the same time. The job mostly consisted of riding around in a golf cart and making sure everything was in order. Between 6 and 8, I took a few laps and picked up trash from the lawn. Some visitors showed up and I waited for the last group to leave at 8:30. Then, I went to close the main gate. While I was passing the chain through the bars and putting the lock on, I noticed a group of people across the street. They were facing me as if they were watching me. After locking the gate, I went back to the cart and drove away. I was almost sure that group was the one they'd asked me to watch for, so I parked the cart at a spot where I could still see them. There seemed to be 3 people. They stayed there for a few more minutes before moving on. I decided to take a lap around the cemetery just to make sure they weren't trying to enter from another point, but I didn't see them again. Around 9 at night, I parked near the gate again, staying there for a few minutes when I heard a sharp sound echo across the field. I turned in the direction of the noise, but it was too dark to see anything. I started the cart and followed the sound. It was so loud and dispersed that I couldn't determine if it was coming from inside or outside the cemetery. As I drove, I began to notice some figures in the distance. There were only 2 of them, not the 3 I had seen earlier. When I approached, they noticed my presence, turning to look at me, but they didn't run. I stopped the cart about 5 meters away and got out. "The place closes at 8:30. You need to leave," I shouted, taking a few steps forward. "Do I really need to call the police?" I added, my voice a bit more tense and irritated. That's when I noticed one of them was holding something in their hand. It was a shovel, but they weren't near any headstones. I looked at the ground next to them and saw a spot where they had clearly started digging. Suddenly, I heard a shout behind me. "Hey!" The 2 in front of me started running, while the guy behind me went in another direction. I ran to the cart, trying to start it to follow the guy, but I quickly realized something was wrong. The cart was shaking and wobbling when I tried to drive. I got out to check and saw that both tires on the left side had been slashed. Desperate, I called the police and ran toward the main building. Luckily, the group didn't seem interested in chasing me. Still, the fact that they had probably slashed the tires with a knife and that it was 3 against 1 left me completely terrified. By the time the police arrived, the group was long gone, but we found the hole they had started digging. We were confused until we found something closer to the fence, not far from where they had been digging. It was a body bag, and yes, there was a body inside. A few days later, we found out that the man in the bag was part of a gang and had probably been killed in a shootout. We believe the group was trying to get rid of the body discreetly, thinking that if they dug a grave and buried it in the cemetery, it would blend in with the other graves and no one would suspect. I can't say the idea was completely absurd, but the execution left much to be desired. None of the men from the group have been found or identified to this day. I work at a cemetery on the outskirts of the city. The place is small, with just a few acres of land. At the time, I had been there for about a year and hated every moment of it. Not so much because it was a cemetery, but because of the constant boredom. I spent the entire nights alone, sitting in a small room with not much to do. There were 2 cameras installed, one on each side of the property, plus another one at the entrance to the building where I stayed. My boss always said that my job was simply to be present and, if anything actually happened, I should call the police and let them handle it. During that entire year, nothing significant had happened. After all, it was a small cemetery in a quiet town. Not much activity was expected. On a Monday night, I parked the car and switched shifts with the daytime colleague. I hadn't slept well, so I brought a cup of coffee to help keep me awake. For the first hour, I stayed alert, sipping coffee, watching the cameras, and checking my phone. At 1 in the morning, sleep started to weigh heavily. I was already dozing off in the chair, and the coffee seemed useless. At some point, I believe I completely fell asleep, and after what felt like 20 minutes, I woke up to a strange noise, the sound of metal creaking behind me. I turned in the chair and saw that the building's door was slightly ajar, gently swaying in the wind. My heart raced with the shock. I got up and pulled the door open a little more, cautiously peeking outside and surveying the surroundings. There was no one in sight. I slammed the door shut and made sure it was properly locked. Maybe I had just been careless when I closed it before, but my whole body was on high alert. I checked the footage from the building's exterior camera, and at least from that point on, no one appeared in the recordings. From that moment on, I was fully awake. I started monitoring each camera almost obsessively. About 10 minutes passed until I saw something move on the screen. The camera showing the farthest corner of the property captured someone walking through the cemetery. I followed their movements as they slowly walked between the gravestones and then stopped. I waited a few moments before picking up the phone and calling the police, keeping my eyes glued to the screen. I spoke to the operator in a low voice, explaining that there was an intruder in the cemetery. As the woman on the other end began to speak, suddenly, the man on the screen took off running, disappearing from the camera. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding, quickly scanning the other cameras for him. It didn't take long before he reappeared on another screen, running again, and then he appeared on the camera that showed the outside of the building where I was. With a tense voice, I described to the operator what was happening and asked her to stay quiet. I set the phone aside and kept watching the camera. The man was now standing right in front of the door. He looked around, scanning the building's facade, until his eyes locked directly onto the camera. That gave me a chill, as if he could see me on the other side of the screen. "Hello? Can you help me?" I heard his muffled voice through the door. Without waiting for any response, he walked away and headed to the back of the building. There were no cameras in that area, but I could hear his footsteps on the grass, as if he was walking right along the wall. Suddenly, his footsteps began to fade quickly. My heart only started to slow down when the police finally arrived. I thought they would think I was crazy, but they soon found clear footprints in the grass. They followed those tracks for a long way past the cemetery boundaries until they disappeared into nothing. That man's behavior was very strange, and the way he asked for help was even more unsettling. I don't know if it was him who left the door open earlier, but now I don't know what to believe anymore. Even though I was terrified, I kept working at the cemetery, and I'm still here to this day. Since then, nothing else has happened, and the man never returned. But I don't think I'll ever fall asleep on the job again. If you're enjoying these stories, don't forget to leave your like. It's very important. Well, let's continue. My friends and I were never exactly the brightest in the group. We did some unbelievable dumb stuff, like exploring abandoned places and sneaking into empty houses. But of all the times we acted without thinking, the most insane was when we decided to go to the cemetery at night. On the other adventures, nothing strange had happened, but this night was very different. At that time, we were in our second year of high school, and since it was a Friday night, of course, we were all together. We hardly ever made plans. We just let the night unfold and came up with something on the spot. Around midnight, two friends decided to leave because they were tired, leaving just me and Carlos. The truth is, neither Carlos nor I were tired yet, but we also didn't want to spend the rest of the night bored. That's when he suggested the cemetery near his house, saying it would be a scary and fun experience to take a walk there in the middle of the night. With no better options, I agreed. I don't remember thinking much about the idea. I knew it would be a bit spooky, but in the end, it was just a cemetery, nothing too serious. We took Carlos's car and went to his house, parked, and walked down the street to the cemetery gate. The entrance was huge and imposing, but the fence around the place was just one of those low wooden ones. We easily jumped over it, and immediately a rush of adrenaline hit us. The place was really creepy, with very little lighting, just a few dim lamps scattered here and there across the cemetery. I honestly don't know what our plan was that night. I guess we just wanted to walk through the cemetery without getting scared and then quietly leave. We had passed about 10 or 15 headstones when Carlos suddenly stopped. He looked ahead and asked me to wait. I couldn't see very well, but far ahead I could make out a figure standing next to one of the headstones, coming in our direction. Carlos and I froze, not sure what to do. Our first thought was that it was some kind of cemetery guard, and we immediately imagined we were about to get caught and maybe even arrested. The man approached, stopping a few meters from us, still too far for us to see clearly who he was. "What are you doing here?" he asked. Carlos, clearly nervous, replied that we were just looking around. "I'll have to show you the way out," said the man. He asked us to follow him and started walking back to where he had come from. I think at that moment, both Carlos and I regretted not running as soon as we saw the figure for the first time. As we walked behind him, the man passed under one of the few lights in the cemetery, and that's when both Carlos and I froze in place. He wasn't dressed like a guard. His clothes were all torn and dirty, something more typical of a homeless person. The man must have noticed we had stopped because he turned around, and we could see something disturbing in his face. He looked completely out of his mind. Then he took a step toward us. "Come here," he shouted, visibly angry. Carlos was the first to run, and I followed right behind him. I could hear the man's footsteps so close that it felt like he was about to catch me at any moment. The adrenaline kicked in and we quickly jumped over the fence. On the other side, we heard him stop and punch the wooden fence in frustration. We ran straight to Carlos's house and didn't tell anyone, except our closest friends, because we knew what we had done was illegal. Carlos and I were almost certain that the man was a homeless person, probably trying to rob us, or, who knows, do something even worse. Fortunately, we never made the mistake of going back there again. For many years, I worked as a caretaker at a rural cemetery in Georgia, a typical summer job for a 16-year-old. My main task was quite simple: clean the headstones, removing accumulated dirt and mud. Nothing extraordinary. To give you a better picture, the cemetery had a building with restrooms for the 5 caretakers who worked there, as well as a small, basic mausoleum. Aside from that, the land was flat, with headstones scattered throughout the area. The place also felt quite isolated, surrounded by dense forests, known to be some of the thickest in Georgia. With such a gloomy setting, It's no surprise that I often got more nervous than necessary. Watching too many horror movies didn't help either, I know. Not exactly the best idea for someone who spends so much time in a cemetery. One night, while doing my rounds, I needed to enter the mausoleum. Some of the wealthier families in the area were buried there, and it was my responsibility to make sure the place was always clean and in order, just as those families demanded. As I walked up to it, something bothered me, an eerie feeling that something was off. I couldn't immediately pinpoint what it was, but it felt like I wasn't alone. Soon after, I saw candlelight coming from the small mausoleum. On top of that, I was almost certain I could hear voices coming from inside. Voices of young people around my age at the time. They were laughing and chuckling in a way that didn't seem healthy at all. Although I hadn't seen anyone enter or leave the cemetery, I wasn't willing to face a group of drunk teenagers on my own, as I'd probably end up getting beaten. So I called the only security guard on duty, an older ex-cop who did a few rounds around the place. He was tough, the kind who loved situations like this, and I knew he wouldn't mind helping me out. When he finally arrived, we went in together. The place was empty, which was strange because I was sure I had heard voices and laughter inside. To make matters worse, there were lit candles around one of the tombs, and the tomb had been opened, revealing the skeleton of a child. Nothing else seemed to have been touched, but that alone was scary enough. The open tomb also contained an old, tattered, knitted doll. Seeing that old doll with a crooked smile, holding the hand of a child's skeleton, was deeply disturbing. The security guard and I left immediately, doing a quick search around the cemetery, hoping to catch those responsible for that desecration. We wanted, at the very least, to glimpse the sick individuals who had violated the girl's final resting place. But we saw no one. This was more frustrating than frightening. After about 15 minutes, we returned to the mausoleum to restore the girl's grave, placing the stone back in its place. As we entered, we saw that the doll, which had been holding hands with the skeleton earlier, was now sitting on the other side of the mausoleum, perfectly upright, with the same unbalanced smile sewn on its face. Whoever was taunting us had returned just to move the doll, just to mess with us. The next day I quit and never went back, not even to visit.